Good morning, everyone. My name is Barry Davis. I am a director at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, serving on its financial management and assurance team. We have a very distinguished panel for today's session with how managers can better identify and manage fraud risk in COVID-19 funding. Our plan is to share some experiences of actual fraud cases in the pandemic relief programs and discuss the value of having a proactive fraud risk management strategy and framework. Next slide. First, we'll start this session with Rebecca Shea. I know Rebecca well. She is the director on GAO's Forensic Audits Investigative Service team. Rebecca is responsible for a body of work that assesses federal agencies' fraud risk management efforts and identifies fraud, waste, and abuse in federal programs. She will be speaking to GAO's framework for managing fraud risks in federal programs and explain how it can help managers identify potential fraud. Next, we will have a question and answer session with Andrea Deadwyler. She is the Assistant Inspector General for Audits at the Small Business Administration's Office of Inspector General. Andrea is responsible for audits, inspections, and evaluations of SBA's programs and operations, encompassing more than $100 billion in guaranteed loans, nearly $100 billion in federal contracting dollars, and more recently, more than $700 billion in pandemic relief funding. We have some questions for Andrea, exploring the types of fraud risk at SBA and how those risks have been mitigated. Following Andrea, Daryl Dazinski, Deputy Commissioner at the Connecticut Department of Labor, will speak. Daryl has experience overseeing the Unemployment Insurance Benefits Program in Connecticut, as well as the Employment Business Services and Veterans Divisions, which offers services to residents through the American Job Center Network and online. Daryl will be speaking to fraud at the state level, and he will share some best practices on how fraud can be mitigated, especially during the pandemic. Last but definitely not least, we will complete our presentation with another question and answer session with Deann Baiza. She is Director of Submission Processing at Treasury's Inspector General for Tax Administration, also known as TIGTA. Deann's audit work includes responsibility for providing oversight of the Internal Revenue Services programs related to the filing and processing of income tax returns, and she has conducted numerous reviews of IRS's efforts to address improper payments and the tax-related identity theft. Deann will be speaking on the types of fraud that were uncovered by TIGTA and explain how fraud risk was mitigated. So a reminder to the audience, at the end of this session, we hope to have some time for audience questions. And if you have any, please put them in the Q&A tab and not the chat tab. So let me begin the conversation by saying that the public health crisis, economic instability, and the flow of federal funds associated with the COVID-19 pandemic created increased pressures and greater opportunities for fraud. However, we believe through proactive management of fraud risks, federal, state, and local officials can help safeguard taxpayer dollars and ensure that they serve their intended purposes. So we're going to start with Rebecca, and Rebecca, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barry, for the introduction and invitation to speak on this panel. And I am pleased to set the stage with a couple of highlights from the fraud risk framework. I think many of you are probably aware of the framework for managing fraud risks in federal programs that GAO issued in 2015, but if not, you can find it online at GAO's website. It is publication GAO-15-593 SP, as in special product. And just some quick background and reminders on the framework. It is designed to help federal program managers proactively and strategically prevent, detect, and respond to fraud. And OMB's Circular A-123 for internal controls points agencies to GAO's framework as guidance for implementing fraud prevention requirements from the Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act that are now incorporated into the Payment Integrity Information Act, or PIA, as we call it. And a GAO regularly uses the framework as criteria for audit, so it's a useful guide for auditors as well. And it's a comprehensive guide with 4 components and 38 leading practices that we don't have time to get into today. So I'm going to focus on 2 key areas. But let's first start with a poll. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to tee up this question and then we'll move over to the poll. What is the best approach to managing fraud risk in emergency situations with respect to balancing controls and program delivery? Okay, Kia, if you could pull up the poll, and folks, go over to your polling tab to put in your responses. Is the best approach to A, operate as you would under normal conditions with no change, B, eliminate all controls apart from self-certification to get the money out the door as quickly as possible and hope that the OIG can catch the fraudsters later? Is it increase controls regardless of impact on program delivery given the heightened likelihood of fraud in emergency programs, or D, adjust controls to a predetermined tolerance based on your program's fraud risk assessment and implement a tailored detection strategy based on known risks? Okay, so you guys are quick. This is great. It looks like the answers are in. And most of you, this is like the SAT best answer. There could be other answers, but we're looking for the best answer here. So the best answer is D. Yes, adjust your controls to a predetermined tolerance based on your program's fraud risk assessment. So good job, everyone there. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, and the reason that I had this poll up is that too often fraud risk management and program delivery are thought of as an either-or proposition, but that's really not the case. And the second component of the fraud risk framework covers leading practices for assessing fraud risk to determine the fraud risk profile. And in that section, we provide an example of adjusting your risk tolerances and controls in a natural disaster situation. And this slide that you see here is an excerpt from a table in GAO's first COVID report that we issued back in July of 2020. And the full table, it's in an appendix on internal controls and fraud risk management. And what we're highlighting here are a few of the ways agencies can potentially balance that equation with some less burdensome controls, considering their specific risk profile. So we recognize there may need to be trade-offs, and you can do that prudently if you have a good handle on your risks, your controls, and the tolerances before, that disaster strikes. Great. Next slide, please, and next poll. Okay, so this next polling question, how can you become more familiar with what fraud looks like in your program? And Kia, if you could pull up the poll, and I'll read through the responses. First, A, collaborate with the OIG to provide information and training on past fraud schemes and emerging trends. B, review Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission press releases on fraud cases related to your agency, program area, or issue. 3, peruse the federal fraud related case appendices and GAO's quarterly COVID-19 reports. D, use GAO's anti-fraud resources to better understand and combat fraud, or E, all of the above. And you guys, you know the trick with the all of the above response. You got it. It is all of the above. And I'll briefly touch on each of these in the next slides. Next slide, please, Kia. Okay. So getting an understanding of what fraud looks like in your programs and what the emerging trends are is an ongoing process. And as you know, once you fix one control weakness, fraudsters are going to find another to exploit. So you should always be learning about how fraud has happened to help you think ahead about what could happen. And component 3, in particular, leading practice 3.4 in the framework, describes some of the ways for doing just that through collaboration with OIGs and other stakeholders. Okay, next slide, please. And you can also find out about fraud schemes and the pandemic relief programs from GAO's enclosures in the recurring reports. These reports have enclosures on just about every program of interest, but I'm going to point to my team's enclosure on federal fraud-related cases. And that enclosure, we've done this for a while now, they detail a wide variety of pandemic fraud schemes associated with federal charges and administrative actions. And we first reported in July of 2020, and our latest report just came out in July of 2021 with another forthcoming in October. So you'll continue to see updated information on fraud schemes as they continue to emerge. So that's another good resource for you. And next slide, please. Okay, and the last resource that I will mention is forthcoming in December. We have developed an interactive, visually engaging, web-based anti-fraud resource. And it's built off a comprehensive ontology of federal fraud that's derived from closed Department of Justice civil and criminal fraud cases. And we designed this resource to help agency employees at all levels better understand and combat fraud in their programs and operations. We think this resource is useful for federal employees, and was designed, specifically with them in mind to help implement the fraud risk framework, but it can be useful for state, local, international, and others as well. So mark your calendars to check out GAO's anti-fraud resource coming in December. And I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions. And back to you, Barry.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was a very interesting slide presentation. Thank you so much. We're going to now turn to Andrea. We're going to have a Q&A session. And let me kind of set this up by saying that the SBA Office of Inspector General was one of the first and most aggressive IG offices to proactively tackle the fraud risks related to pandemic funding. And I say aggressive in the very positive sense, Andrea. Thumbs up to you and your colleagues. This was really important because as of May 31st of this year, Congress had appropriated about $838 billion for the pandemic business loan program. So Andrea, we have two slides here and two sets of questions. The first set have to do with what were the risks and occurrence of fraud. And so I'll go through those questions quickly and then give you a chance to respond. First, please share with us some examples of the types of fraud and related root causes that you've uncovered during your work. How did businesses and individuals defraud the federal government? How much was lost? Have some of these funds been recovered? Thank you. Go ahead, Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Barry. So the biggest concern for our office was the agency's ability to quickly provide capital to small businesses without establishing proper controls. We obviously were concerned about how that would serve to increase fraud risk. The key word for us was balance, not lowering the guardrails altogether, but implementing upfront controls to ensure only eligible businesses would benefit from these vital programs. So when you say root causes, you have to point to the control environment. To be fair, though, SBA was charged with providing much needed aid to small businesses in record time, which they did. They accomplished 14 years worth of lending in just 14 days when the CARES Act programs were initially rolled out. But unfortunately, the balance was not there. The balance to ensure upfront controls were in place to mitigate fraud risk. There's always, they always have to, that's always a struggle, even with the disaster programs, because the need obviously is there to get the aid out there, but there's also a need to protect and to have some guardrails up with regard to the control environment to ensure only eligible folks take advantage of the programs. Some of the fraud that we alerted the agency to included businesses that didn't exist prior to the pandemic, loans to individuals on Treasury's do not pay list, multiple loan applications from the same IP addresses, changes in banking information prior to disbursement of funds. And that was just a few. There was also a significant amount of identity theft, especially in the economic injury disaster loan program, EIDL. In one case example from our investigative team, we had a Los Angeles man who was charged in July for fraudulently obtaining about $9 million in COVID relief funds, some of which he gambled away in Las Vegas and used to make risky stock market investments. To get these funds, he submitted fraudulent loan applications on behalf of different companies with numerous false and misleading statements about companies' business operations and payroll expenses. He also used aliases, submitted fake and altered documents, including bogus federal tax filings and employee payroll records. This was just one case, but our investigations division continues to combat fraud in these programs, as demonstrated in the many arrests, guilty pleas, and prison sentences associated with these cases. In the last week or so, we had a Missouri man plead guilty to $335 million in fraud and $615,000 in tax violations related to COVID-19 funds. We also had just recently a reality TV star who was sentenced to over 17 years in prison for his involvement in PPP fraud and for operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. And the list goes on. When it comes to how the businesses defrauded the federal government. Those were some examples, but for PPP, the three main types of fraud patterns that we've seen include people who claim to have a business that didn't actually exist, people who have businesses but fraudulently claim more employees than they have or higher pay for those employees, and people who have businesses who rightly claim the number of employees but use the money for fraudulent or unallowable purposes. With IDLE, we're seeing the more sophisticated fraud rings primarily focused, like I said, on identity theft. When you ask how much was lost and have any of these funds been recovered, with regard to our office, to date, we have our IDLE and PPP investigative work has resulted in 307 indictments, 205 arrests, and 69 convictions, with associated amounts totaling more than $460 million. Additionally, OIG's collaboration with SBA and Secret Service has resulted in the seizure of more than $995 million stolen by fraudsters in the IDLE program. We also played a key role in assisting the financial institutions in the return of another $3.1 billion to SBA's IDLE program. Much of the audit work we've done in this area has identified billions in potential fraud, and we currently have work underway to further validate some of those results. A lot of that work was based on our data analytics efforts in looking at eligibility and fraud indicators associated with the loans SBA issued.
Thank you, Andrea. Very impressive statistics on the recoveries. So I think we're ready for the next. You were completing your conversation, correct?
Yes.
Andrea? Yeah,
Yes.
okay. Let me sure.
Ready for the next.
Okay. No, really, very, very interesting information as well. I mean, you know, the individual who took the money and went to Vegas. I mean, you just would never even conceive something like that would happen. So, you know, thank you for sharing all of that. All right. So let's go to the next slide. We have some other questions for you still. And these have to do with, you know, fraud risks and how they might be mitigated. So please tell us about the actions that both the SBA agency and the OIG took to mitigate the risk of fraud in COVID-related funding. Has the agency or the OIG analyzed data on fraud trends or identified the most important control deficiencies? And are the agency and the OIG working well together in addressing fraud risks?
Okay, again, I'll take those in pieces. So when you talk about the efforts to mitigate fraud risk, OIG has actively engaged SBA leadership throughout the pandemic to notify them of preliminary findings so they could respond in real time to prevent losses to the taxpayer. As I mentioned earlier, the agency's control environment, particularly when the program began, was not sufficient to prevent rapid fraud from occurring. Our office issued 3 reports to the agency before the first loan was made, emphasizing the importance of upfront controls based on lessons learned from past economic relief programs and disasters. We knew that the weaknesses we found in the past would be greatly magnified with programs as large as PPP and IDLE. So we offered recommendations on how to best mitigate the risk that SBA would be facing. We also issued early fraud alerts to provide information to the public regarding fraud schemes our investigators were seeing. We met and still meet regularly with the administrator to share insights, glean from our work, and to learn about concerns or plans that the agency may have in these areas. To date, we've published, my office has published 16 reports on pandemic relief programs, sounding the alarm early when we identified troubling indications of rampant fraud in the PPP and IDLE programs. Based on this work, though, the agency has started implementing corrective actions to address some of the control weaknesses we've identified. For example, after we notified the agency of risk associated with batch processing of loans, they revised the process and began placing hold codes on loans that had certain fraud indicators. They also implemented a process to place holds on loans when borrowers changed bank account information before disbursement. In addition, based on one of our reports, SBA started working with Treasury's Do Not Pay office to implement a control that would allow them to check against that list to ensure eligibility of borrowers. So we have been very proactive in our oversight of pandemic funds and our efforts to identify and track those who seek to defraud the government. we believe our office has had significant impact in these programs, and our oversight of these funds will continue.
Thank you, Andrea. I agree. You really have set the bar high when it comes to OIG offices that are addressing some of these issues related to pandemic funding. So thank you very much. So at this time, I think we're going to switch now to talk to Daryl. Daryl is going to explain some of the experiences that he's had at the state level, particularly with unemployment insurance. So I will just turn it over to you, Daryl. I think you're going to start with a polling question, right?
That's right. And thank you, Barry. Yes, so we'll wait for the slide to change for polling question number 3. Excellent, thank you. Question is, how would you diminish the risk that your federal state benefit program is providing funding to criminal organizations using a financial institution's virtual and cash apps while still dispersing funds timely? Answer A, continue to pay until the customer complains. Answer B, review the financial institution operations for preventing future payments. Answer C, ask the financial institution to investigate legitimacy of their customer. Or D, switch the customer's payment method from direct deposit to state unemployment insurance debit card method. And so if you go to the question polling tab, we'll receive your answers. Great. It's a very difficult question, and I apologize for that, but the first and correct answer would be B, review the financial institution operations for preventing future payments. C and D are also important, and we'll speak to these opportunities to correct the fraud opportunities with the criminals further on in this discussion. So next slide. I wanted to paint the picture, so to speak, what our Connecticut Department of Labor Agency unemployment insurance program was up against at the prior to, at the start of, and then coming out of the pandemic COVID-19. At the beginning, or prior to, excuse me, of the pandemic, Connecticut Department of Labor's unemployment insurance program staffing was reduced by about 35% starting in 2015. And so we were at a very low employee capacity to begin with. We had also allocated and prepared our subject matter experts for a modernization effort that was targeted to be a 5-year effort that began in 2016 that was supposed to go live in 2021. And 2% of our staff were telework ready, telework capacity. We did not have a call center, contact center for individuals, customers to receive information or support. They actually had to go in person to our American Job Centers. And we were maintaining 5 different legacy systems with minimal IT support and resources in existence. And then when the pandemic was beginning, we were seeing it starting around the world, we met around, we did roundtables, and we started to prepare in what if situations. What if we had double, triple the number of claims? What if we couldn't report to the offices and had to work from a remote location? And as we started working through finding where our pain points were, we were beginning to address those and preparing. When the pandemic started for Connecticut, it was Friday, March 13th, 2020. It was also a full moon, so I think everything was targeted against us. But all of the claims started to spike in all areas of employment throughout the state. And with the state shutting down, so to speak, in a lot of different areas to protect our citizens, they became unemployed over the weekend. And so we saw a serious spike in claims, anywhere between 15 and 20,000 initial claims applications for unemployment per day, where we would normally receive 3,000 per week. So it was an enormous increase and a avalanche of activity. We prepared for the fraud and the criminals to the best of our ability, and we utilize a lot of the knowledge and resources that we've had over the past recessionary times in at least the last 3 decades. And again, we were using the same technology that we've had in place for a very long time. When we talk about the volume, today we've paid out over $9.7 billion just in the state of Connecticut in unemployment insurance since the beginning of the pandemic. Over the last 18, 19 months, the period of the pandemic, that would normally be about $1 billion. So again, it's about 10 times the amount, and it's tremendous amount of support from where we are. 1.5 million applications for unemployment insurance and all the various programs came through our agency. So as we begin to address this pandemic volume with the eye towards the integrity of the program, the unemployment insurance program is a balance. We have to and are mandated by the federal government to make sure that we are preparing and paying individuals properly and timely. So it's not a situation where we can take weeks or months to pay. We do have to pay when due. So next slide, please. So as we go through what we had to keep track of and are required to maintain the unemployment insurance program and the payments, again, keeping an eye towards integrity, what we did use are our lessons learned, our best practices that came out of the Great Recession. So in the Great Recession for Connecticut began in the summer of 2008, 9, 2010, and continued a few months after that as well. We learned the criminal activities. We learned the gangs in Nigeria, the criminal actions from Florida, New York, etc. But with the pandemic, what we were beginning to experience were other countries and organizational cultures that were existing: Russia, China, South Korea, and so forth. So we were beginning to see a lot more activity, larger scale, organized, very organized criminal activity. We created this organizational structure within our agency where we brought in all of our managerial and all of our resources to address as much as possible and as quickly as possible all of the issues that we were seeing and best practices on how to resolve. We collaborated with a lot of outside organizations, including, and not limited to though, U.S. Department of Labor, the National Office, the Regional Office, the Office of Inspector General, our national NASWA, our National Association of State Workforce Agencies, specifically the Integrity Center, our Connecticut State Police, Major Crimes Unit, the Connecticut State Auditors, the Comptroller's Office, the Attorney General's Office, the Office of Chief State Attorney, the State Department of Banking, and the banking partners that we have, which in Connecticut is Chase and Key Bank. And these entities, we met with them daily, weekly, and monthly, and we continue to do so. And we worked in an environment where we explained the situation, what we were seeing as far as fraud and risk association with that fraud. And through that collaboration, we created opportunities to prevent and detect ongoing fraudulent activities within this structure. We prepared technology and automation. We planned for it and we implemented it, and it was all within a very fast-moving platform. It could not happen fast enough because the organized criminals were really prepared somehow for this activity, using the unemployment insurance program to their benefit and stealing this unemployment insurance monies in a criminal theme. We received a lot of support from our vendors, Resource Revenues Solutions, Inc., Tata Consulting Services, Salesforce, IBM. We created a New England Department of Labor work group with our New England states and neighboring states, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. We met daily and weekly, and we shared our best practices. We shared what we were experiencing. So if something was happening in Rhode Island or New Hampshire, we all knew about it and we were prepared, and we were fighting and preventing that from happening in our own state. We also provided ideas and mindful of all these new concepts, and we really did a great job as far as risk management and mitigating, diminishing, learning, and supporting each other along the way. The next slide, please. So the customer ID proofing, it's really about supporting the customer, our citizens in the state of Connecticut, and making sure that they understand that they are being attacked. Their identities are being stolen and used with a criminal theme, and their monies that maybe should be going to them are going to outside criminal entities. And just to be prepared for such, we had implemented, as I said, very quickly, technology around multi-factor authentication. We included reCAPTCHA and robot type prohibited practices. We partnered with our Department of Motor Vehicles to utilize the licensing as an ID proofing mechanism, and also other ID proofing establishments. We were finding serious trends every single day on what the criminals were using, and we would use that data to create additional queries and preventative measures, so that when claims were coming in by the second and sometimes by the minute, we would be able to identify those and label those as a fraudulent activity, and then take subsequent action so that we do not process or pay these criminals with their intent to steal the money from our Connecticut citizens. We were aware of social media and the attacks that were occurring in the social media arena. And we were working with Facebook, Twitter, etc., to make sure that our customers who were being phished, so to speak, to make sure that they knew what the Connecticut Department of Labor staff representation and how we communicate with them and how we do not, more importantly. So we continue today, and social media continues to be a serious concern. The criminals use it to their advantage, and unfortunately, some of our customers fall to that actionable item. Next slide, please. Really, solid communication with the public is key. They really want to know and need to know what is happening with their account, with their claims. They need to understand the eligibility rules for unemployment insurance, which are very, very complex, both on the federal and state laws. We tried to explain to them to avoid scams and phishing attempts. And unfortunately, what we witnessed is account takeovers, because when some of our customers, we call them claimants, provide their username and password, who they think is a Department of Labor representative is actually a criminal. And then what will happen is the customer will file their weekly claim, certify their weekly claim for payment, and then the monies will actually go to the criminal. And so what happens is the criminal will gain access to the user account and change the banking information to that criminal. And so again, when the claimant customer certifies their weekly claim for payment, the monies would normally go to their bank account and is now going to the criminal bank account. And what we found with the banks is that a lot of the virtual banks, some legitimate, and in some cases will have cash apps and other fast-moving technologies. So before you know it, the monies are going to a particular bank, virtual bank, and then they're getting moved to a cash app, and then they're moved right out of the country, again, to those criminal organizations. And so it's virtually impossible to receive that money back. So that's primarily why what you need to understand from a government agency is how these banks are working towards preventing payments from going out of the country, from going to criminal and not legitimate individuals. And that was the best course of action for us. So we would prevent the virtual banks, and we would prevent the cash apps from gaining access to any further payments. Next slide, please. So as we had to learn a lot more about banking, something that never occurred before, we had to learn quickly how all the banks operate and how the monies, unemployment insurance monies, once it leaves the agency's control to the banks, how the ACH and the debit cards actually work within its structure. And as you all probably know, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of banking financial institutions throughout our country. And so it is a very serious concern today. And even though we're mitigating the risk and we're preventing massive amounts of fraud, it's a serious, serious problem. And we'll continue to collaborate with our banking and national partners. And the goal is always to shut down the organized crime. So, Barry, thank you very much for allowing me to present.
Oh, thank you, Daryl. That was great. And I really appreciate your emphasizing the importance of these collaborative relationships with other states, with the federal government, with the banks. That's really important in attacking this issue, so to speak. So thank you. We're next going to start talking to Deann. We've got some questions for her, and hopefully she's got answers to those. Let me start by saying that the CARES Act, Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and the American Rescue Plan Act authorized Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service to issue 3 rounds of economic impact payments, also known as EIPs. These are direct payments to help individuals alleviate financial stress due to the pandemic. Congress had appropriated about $855 billion for the economic impact payments as of May 31st of this year. So we have for Deann, similar to Andrea, a series of questions. The first are going to address the risk and occurrence of fraud. And so the questions to you are, please share with us examples of the types of fraud and related root causes that you uncovered during your pandemic work at TIGTA. Were these primarily related to a lack of identity verification or stolen identities? What are some of the scams that have been perpetrated? Are there estimates on how much money was lost? And have some of these funds been recovered? Deann.
Good morning. Relative to the earned or the economic impact payments, there really are 2 types of fraud that are associated with those payments. The first is what IRS refers to as first-person fraud. That's where a legitimate taxpayer falsifies something on their tax return that would then result in a fraudulent payment. The second is identity-related fraud, and that's where we get into the stolen identities. Now, the economic stimulus payments are a little bit different than the PPP loans, for example, or the unemployment enhanced unemployment payments, in that an EIP is based on the taxpayer's filed tax return. So a lot of the fraud that we saw in the EIP mirrors fraud in the base tax system. It's the same kind of fraud that occurs when individuals file their tax return. Some of the things that are inherent to those processes are things like a particular dependent who is claimed by multiple taxpayers on their tax return. The reason that that's a valuable scheme for folks is the refundable tax credits, including the EIP, which was an advance payment of a refundable tax credit, are often based on the number of children that you have. And so the more children you can put on your tax return, the higher the payment you're going to receive. That was something that was very common to things that we saw in the economic impact payments. But within those economic impact payments, there was one segment of eligible individuals that IRS and TIGTA knew were going to present a significantly elevated level of risk for fraud. Within the CARES Act, the IRS was directed to issue economic impact payments to people who are not required to file a tax return. That meant that the IRS had to create a process for these folks to let IRS know they were out there and where to find them so that IRS could then send them their stimulus payment. This happens to also be a segment of the population that is very often targeted for identity theft. These are people who typically do not do their day-to-day activities online. And so fraudsters, often organized entities, as Daryl was commenting on, can easily assume those individuals' identities, conduct business in a virtual world, and oftentimes go undetected by the true individual until years later. So that is probably the largest area of fraud that was not already mitigated, if that makes sense. IRS, due to the amount of fraud in the normal tax processing system and the attempts to manipulate the tax code, IRS already has a pretty robust fraud detection process in place, both for first-person fraud and identity-related fraud. And so they really leveraged the processes they already had in place. As far as estimates, as far as how much money was lost, based on our audit work, we identified more than 4.4 million payments, totaling more than $5.5 billion that were issued to potentially ineligible individuals. And in that pocket, we know there is fraud. The difficulty for us and for the IRS is proving fraud. So differentiating between an error, a taxpayer who might have made a legitimate error on their tax return, and a fraudulent tax return is very, very difficult. Those investigations take a lot of time, and IRS is still in the process of doing those fraud investigations. So we don't have really confirmed numbers yet as to the total extent of fraud related to those EIP payments, but there is a potential for at least $5.5 billion. The other unique thing about IRS's fraud detection processes is a lot of them occur before the payments are made. IRS, through its experience, has learned that once the payment goes out, similar to what Daryl was discussing, you very rarely get it back. And so they have worked really hard to develop what they refer to as pre-refund detection processes. And what those processes do is when they identify potential fraud, they stop the payment so the money never leaves. That gives the IRS additional time to then confirm whether or not that payment is legitimate and this can then subsequently be released, or whether that payment is fraudulent. And if so, then they've protected the payment from ever leaving. IRS's pre-refund fraud detection processes as of the end of December 2020 had identified 528,388 questionable, we refer to them as non-filer tax returns. Those are only those documents that non-filer population that I mentioned sent to the IRS to let IRS know they were out there and that they wanted their payment, they were eligible for their payment. 528,388 of those returns were identified as potentially fraudulent by the IRS. IRS had confirmed at the end of December that 46,000 of those were in fact fraudulent, and the payments that were protected on those totaled $55 million. So that's $55 million in payments that the IRS did not issue. In addition, there were numbers of taxpayers out there, some associated, like I said, with those dependent schemes, where the IRS put out information messages, we'll put it that way, on irs.gov. Our Office of Investigations folks were also continually putting out PSAs, alerting individuals to fraud schemes, as well as, clarifying folks that were eligible to receive a payment and were not, and encouraging individuals who thought they may have received a payment and maybe shouldn't, to return those payments. And believe it or not, IRS did report receiving quite a few of those payments back. As of the time that we reported our last report, I'm sorry, I had the figure right here. The IRS had received back approximately $3 million in payments, voluntarily returned payments. So IRS considers those to be recovered payments as well.
Very good. Thank you, Deann. Let's go to the next slide where we have another set of questions.
Sure.
How were fraud risks mitigated? Please tell us about the actions that both the IRS and TIGTA took to mitigate the risk of fraud in this COVID-related funding. Has the agency or the OIG analyzed data on fraud trends or identified control deficiencies? And are the agency and TIGTA working well together in addressing fraud risks?
Okay. The TIGTA has conducted extensive data analysis. As I mentioned before, both we and the IRS really leveraged information that we have already learned about tax-related fraud, identity-related fraud, those kinds of things, and applied them to what we anticipated happening related to the economic impact payments. IRS had the benefit of being involved in issuing stimulus payments prior, I believe back in 2008. They looked back at their lessons learned from those stimulus payments and tried to build controls up front to mitigate a lot of the things that had happened last time in anticipation that they would reoccur. So it was really looking back at lessons learned, both within their fraud detection processes as well as their own experience with issuing stimulus payments to the public before. Our Office of Investigations also works very closely with the IRS Criminal Investigations Division to investigate fraud from the perpetrator level, as far as getting to those more organized organizations and the bad actors to try to shut them down, so that once you shut down the bad actor, the number of claims or the payments going out should decrease as well. From the Office of Audit side, what we've done and are continuing to do is to conduct what we call real-time audits. And those are audits where we are actively evaluating the actions the IRS is taking as they are happening. And oftentimes we're reviewing pre-decisional information. We're reviewing anticipated controls and criteria that the IRS plans to put in place but has not yet implemented. And through that process, we're able to then provide alerts to accounts management in areas that we see where there could be potential weaknesses, areas that could be manipulated by bad actors, so that they can then close those loopholes before those processes are even implemented. Through the course of our review, our first review on the economic impact payment, we issued 24 separate alerts to IRS management before we even issued our first report. which was really beneficial to IRS management and us, because it allowed us to get real-time feedback from the IRS. It allowed IRS management to take action very quickly to prevent additional harm to legitimate taxpayers and prevent fraudulent payments from going out.
Thank you, Deann. Yeah, your office is doing incredible work, and we really appreciate the efforts that you do to, ensure that those funds are protected, the taxpayers' funds are protected. I was told by support that we might have a couple of minutes. So if the audience is willing, we have a number of good questions, but there's one that I might just turn to our panel and ask if they could each keep their comments response to about 20 seconds. The question is, when considering fraud risks, how do you prioritize fraud prevention efforts, size of the program, potential risk, etc.? 20 seconds, each of you, please.
All right, I'll start off and say, we talk about that in the fraud risk framework. And if you're doing a fraud risk assessment and you are looking at the likelihood and the impact of the risks, the inherent risks that you're facing, you've looked at the controls that you have for managing those risks. You should have, through that process, a good sense of what risks are still residual, still existing, that you can prioritize, because you're going to be aware of the controls that you have to address them and the impacts that they are going to have. And so you would base your decision on that assessment.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Who wants to go next?
This is Andrea. I really can't add much to that. I think that's basically the same approach. That's exactly what Rebecca said. I don't have anything I can add.
Great, thank you. Daryl, were you going to speak?
Sure. No, I agree. It's really about the data, understanding what the criminal organizations are using, and how they're using stolen identity, and making sure that you're adding all of that information data to prevent going forward, because it's going to continue to change, and the next opportunity for the criminal activities is going to be different than we have today. So use the lessons learned and build from it.
Thanks, Daryl. Deann, any closing thoughts?
No, I would just reiterate what's already been said. It's a lot of looking at what you've already learned, looking at the processes that are currently in place, identifying the weaknesses or the gaps in those processes, and then moving forward from there.
Well, thank you. I want to thank our panel, Rebecca, Andrea, Daryl, and Deann, for sharing their experiences today. Many thanks also to AGA for giving us this platform, and then special thanks to both Kia Lohr and Jeff Tilton for their technical assistance. So thank you, audience. Appreciate your interest. The evaluation form should be up there now for you under this tab, and everyone just have a good rest of the day.